They handed me a suitcase on a Tuesday evening in late November. And for a moment I just stood there in my own hallway, holding it, not quite believing what was happening. My son-in-law had set it at my feet like he was returning a library book. My daughter stood 2 steps behind him, arms crossed, eyes on the floor. The suitcase was mine. I recognized the broken zipper pull I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. They'd gone through my closet. They'd packed my things. And they'd decided, apparently, that this was the cleanest way to have a conversation they'd been avoiding for months. What they didn't know, what neither of them had ever once thought to ask, was that the house they were standing in, the house my daughter had been living in rent-free for 4 years, was mine. Still mine. Had always been mine. My name was the only name on the title deed registered with the land registry in Ontario. I had paid off the mortgage in 2009. I had the property tax bills in a folder in my filing cabinet. 12 years of them, everyone in my name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story didn't start with a suitcase. It started with grief, and with the kind of love that makes you do things you probably should have thought through a little more carefully. My wife passed away in the spring of 2018. Lung cancer, 7 months from diagnosis to the end. We'd been married for 38 years, and I won't pretend those last months weren't the hardest of my life, or that I handled everything that came after with any particular grace. I didn't. I rattled around our house in Barrie for almost a year, trying to figure out what a man does with himself when the person he built everything around is suddenly gone. My daughter, she's the younger of my 2 kids, had been living in Calgary with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. Her husband was in oil and gas, and for a while that had been good. Then it wasn't. By the time her mother passed, they were already in trouble, though I didn't know the full extent of it then. She called me about 14 months after the funeral. She was crying, and it took me a few minutes to understand what she was saying. They were going to lose their apartment. Her husband had lost his position months earlier and hadn't told her the whole truth about their finances. The savings were gone. They needed to start over, and they didn't know where to go. I told her to come home to Ontario. I hadn't planned to offer the house outright. Honestly, in that first conversation, I think I just meant come and stay for a while. Get back on your feet. But over the next few weeks, as I understood more about how bad things were, I started to think about what my wife would have done. She would have opened the door without a second thought. She would have said, "This is family. What else is there?" So I did. I told my daughter that she and her husband and the kids could move into the house in Barrie. I would move into the smaller property I had in Collingwood, a place I'd bought years earlier as a rental investment, which had been sitting empty since the last tenant moved out the previous fall. I'd been thinking about retiring up there anyway. The timing felt right, or at least that's what I told myself. What I didn't do, and I've thought about this many times since, was sit down with everyone at the kitchen table and make it explicitly clear what the arrangement was. I said they could live there. I said I was going to Collingwood. I did not say, "This is temporary," or "This is a loan," or "You are tenants," or "The house is still mine." I just assumed those things were obvious. The deed hadn't changed. Nothing had been signed. It was my house. Of course it was still my house. I was a 61-year-old widower who was grieving and lonely and wanted to do something good. I wasn't thinking about what happens when people start to fill in the blanks themselves. The first couple of years were fine, or fine enough. I drove down to Barrie every few weeks. My grandchildren were 7 and 9 when they moved in, and being around them was the best thing that happened to me in that whole difficult period. My daughter and I talked regularly. Her husband, I'll be honest, I had never warmed to him the way you hope to warm to the person your child chooses, but he was trying, and I gave him credit for that. He found work eventually, not in oil and gas. He retrained and got into project management for a construction firm in Barrie. It wasn't the income they'd had in Calgary, but it was steady, and I could see them stabilizing. I was glad. What I didn't notice, or didn't let myself notice, was that the more stable they became, the more the house stopped feeling like something I had generously offered and started feeling, to them, like something they had earned. I don't know exactly when that shift happened. but I noticed it in small ways before I understood what it meant. The first time I came down for a weekend and mentioned that I'd been thinking about redoing the back deck, it had been on my list for years. My son-in-law said, with complete casualness, "Yeah, we've actually been thinking about doing something different back there, opening it up more." Not, "Great idea, let's talk about it." Just, "We've been thinking." Like the decisions about that deck had already become his to make. I let it go. A few months later, my daughter called to tell me they were planning to renovate the main bathroom. Not asking, telling. She mentioned they'd already gotten a couple of quotes. I said something like, "That's a big project," and she said, "Yeah, but it's overdue. The tiles are original to the house," which was true. But I said, I'd want to be involved in that conversation before anything gets decided. And there was a pause on the line that I still think about. Like I'd said something unexpected. Like she didn't quite understand why I would need to be consulted. I should have said it then, clearly and directly. I am consulted because this is my house. My name is on the deed. My name is on the property tax bill. Nothing changes about this house without my agreement. I should have said all of that. Instead, I said, "Just keep me in the loop," and we moved on. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but the clearest one. By the third year, my son-in-law had started calling it our home in conversations. Not their home. Our home, including himself in a kind of ownership that had never been established. At first, I thought it was just a figure of speech, the way people say we about the city they live in. But then I started to notice other things. He'd had a friend over to look at the garage, some renovation idea. And when I happened to be visiting that weekend, he introduced me to this man as my father-in-law. He used to live here. I was standing in my own garage, the one I'd built a workbench in 20 years earlier, and I was being described as someone from a previous chapter. I said something light, let the moment pass, drove back to Collingwood that Sunday evening with a cold feeling I couldn't shake. That fall, I got a call from my son-in-law that I wasn't expecting. He wanted to talk about something, he said. Something he and my daughter had been discussing. Would I be free for a call that week? We set up a time, and he explained. In the organized, confident way he approaches everything, like he's running a project meeting, that they had been thinking seriously about their long-term situation. They loved the house, the kids were settled in school, the neighborhood was good. They wanted to stay, and they had been looking at their finances, and they thought they were now in a position to start building some equity. Equity, he said. He wanted to know if I'd be open to a conversation about a formal arrangement, transferring the property into their names. He framed it carefully, said they understood. There might be tax implications for me, said they'd want to do it properly. He was even gracious enough to say they recognized what I'd done for them, and they didn't take it for granted. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and did not say what came into my head, which was, "You want me to give you my house?" Instead, I said I would think about it. I told him it was a significant decision and I needed some time. He said he understood, completely, no pressure. They just wanted me to know where they were. I hung up and sat in the kitchen of my Collingwood property for a long time. To be clear about something, I had thought, vaguely, over the years, that maybe someday the house in Barrie would be part of what I left to my children. It was a reasonable thing to think about. But someday is not now, and an inheritance is not a transfer on demand, and the quiet confidence in my son-in-law's voice. Like this was a negotiation about something that was already halfway theirs, unsettled me in a way I didn't have words for yet. I talked to my son. He lives in Ottawa, works in the federal public service. He's steady and practical, and he listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Dad, you need to talk to a lawyer before you say anything else to them." He was right. I called a real estate solicitor in Barrie the following week. The lawyer was a woman about my age, sharp and no nonsense, and she did not seem surprised by anything I told her. She had seen versions of this before, she said. Family arrangements that start with good intentions and no paperwork have a way of becoming complicated. She walked me through my position. The property was unambiguously mine. There was no legal claim my daughter or son-in-law could make to it. No tenancy agreement existed. which actually created a slightly awkward situation regarding their occupancy rights. But the ownership question was not complicated. It was my house. She also advised me to think carefully about what I wanted to do. Did I want to transfer the property eventually? Did I want to bring them in as co-owners? Did I want to put it into a trust for the grandchildren? Did I want to sell it at some point? All of those were options. But she encouraged me to make that decision on my own timeline, not theirs, and to make it clearly and deliberately, not because I'd been made to feel like I owed them something. I went home and I sat with all of that for several weeks. I did not call my son-in-law back. Not yet. What happened next was something I didn't anticipate, and I think about it now as the moment when everything changed. In February, this was about 4 months after the phone call, my daughter texted me on a Wednesday afternoon asking if I had any documents related to the house. Utility history, that kind of thing, she said. She was sorting some paperwork. I thought that was a slightly odd request, but I didn't overthink it. I said I had everything filed and would dig it out if she needed something specific. She didn't follow up. 2 weeks later, I had a call from a real estate agent I didn't know. She introduced herself cheerfully, mentioned she was working with a family in Barrie, and said she was hoping to speak with the owner of the property on Sanford Avenue. She'd found my name in the registry. I told her she had reached the owner. There was a pause. She said she was a little confused. She had been working with a couple who had presented themselves as the owners, were looking to list the property, and had engaged her to do a market evaluation. I asked her to repeat that. She did. I thanked her, told her there had been a misunderstanding, and I would be in contact. And then I ended the call. I sat very still in my kitchen in Collingwood for what felt like a long time. My daughter and her husband had approached a real estate agent. They had represented themselves as the owners of my house. They had initiated the process of listing my property for sale. I thought about the text asking about utility documents. I thought about sorting paperwork. I thought about the bathroom renovation quotes and the back deck plans and used to live here, and our home, and the call asking about transferring equity. I thought about my wife. I thought about what I had done and why I had done it. I thought about what she would say to me right now, in this kitchen, if she were sitting across from me. She would say, "You know what you need to do." I called my lawyer back. She did not say "I told you so," which I appreciated. She laid out the situation calmly. The agent had found the correct owner through the land registry, which meant the process had stalled the moment she made contact with me. My daughter and son-in-law could not proceed with a sale. No title search would clear. No mortgage lender would approve a transaction. No real estate solicitor would close a deal on a property they didn't own. The listing would go nowhere. But, my lawyer said, the situation needed to be addressed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was my family attempting to sell my home. I needed to decide how I wanted to handle it. I drove to Barrie the following Saturday. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to have these conversations in person, in the house, in the kitchen where I'd eaten 1,000 meals and watched my grandchildren learn to walk. I drove the 90 minutes down from Collingwood, turned into the driveway, and sat in the car for a few minutes before I went in. My daughter answered the door. She looked surprised to see me, then uncertain, and I knew she knew something was coming, even if she didn't know what I knew yet. I asked if we could sit down. All three of us. Her husband came in from the living room. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one my wife had picked out at a shop in Barrie decades ago, and he had the expression of a man who has been waiting for a meeting he'd hoped would be postponed indefinitely. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. I have been angry in my life, and I have said things in anger that I wished I could take back. I did not want this to be one of those conversations. So I kept my voice even, and I said what I needed to say. I told them that I had received a call from a real estate agent. I told them I knew they had initiated a listing process for the property. I told them I understood there had been some confusion, possibly a long and slow confusion that had built up over years, about the ownership of this house, and I was there to clear it up. I set the most recent property tax assessment on the table. My name on it, plain as anything. I set down a photocopy of the title registration, my name. I set down the certificate of discharge from the mortgage lender, dated 2009, confirming full repayment. My name. I said, "This house belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. Nothing has ever been signed to change that. I offered you a place to live because you needed help and because I loved you and because that's what family does. But that was never a transfer of ownership, and I should have made that clearer from the start. That is the one thing I'm willing to take responsibility for today." My son-in-law opened his mouth, and I said quietly, "Please let me finish." I told him that I had not decided what I was going to do with the property in the long term. That was still my decision to make on my own time. What I had decided was that the current arrangement needed to change. I had spoken with a solicitor. I was going to have a proper occupancy agreement drawn up, reflecting reality, that they were living in my home as occupants, not as owners. If they wanted to remain, we would sign it. If they didn't want to sign it, we would need to discuss other arrangements. My daughter's eyes were full of tears by this point. My son-in-law's face had gone through several things. Shock, calculation, something that looked briefly like the beginning of an argument, and had landed on a kind of resignation. He said, "We thought," and I said, "I know what you thought, but thinking something doesn't make it true." The silence in that kitchen lasted a long time. My daughter eventually said she was sorry. Not a big dramatic apology, just a quiet, tired one. The kind that carries some real weight precisely because it doesn't have a lot of words around it. She said she didn't know how it had gotten so far. She said she thought, and here she looked at her husband, that they had both convinced themselves over time that it was more settled than it was, that they had filled in blanks that should have been addressed years ago. I believed her. I believed the first part, at least. I was less sure how much of it was genuine confusion and how much was a story they'd told themselves because it was convenient. 4 years old, and I was sitting across from my daughter, and I didn't have the energy or the desire to prosecute the question. I just needed things to be clear going forward. Her husband said very little for the rest of the afternoon. He made himself a coffee, stood at the kitchen counter, answered my questions in short sentences. He was not a man who handled losing ground gracefully, and I understood that. What I needed from him wasn't grace. I needed his signature on a document, and eventually, some months later, I got it. The occupancy agreement was drawn up by my solicitor. It specified the arrangement clearly. They were living in the property, at my discretion, with a notice period I was legally required to provide if I needed them to leave. It wasn't a rental agreement with payments. I wasn't interested in charging my daughter rent. But it was honest. It said what the situation actually was, in writing, signed by everyone. The real estate agent, I was told, was professional about the whole thing. These misunderstandings happen, apparently, more than people realize. In the months after that Saturday, things were awkward in the way things always are after a rupture. My son-in-law and I were polite and distant. My daughter called me more than she had in years, which felt like its own kind of apology. The grandchildren had no idea anything had happened, which was exactly right. They were 12 and 14 by then, and they didn't need to be carrying any of this. My son drove down from Ottawa in the spring, and the four of us, him and his family, my daughter and her kids, spent a long weekend in Barrie. My son-in-law was away for work, which I suspect was not entirely coincidental. It was the first time in years that I felt fully comfortable in that house. We cooked too much food and watched a movie the kids wanted to see and sat on the back deck in the evening with the kind of quiet that used to be ordinary and had become something I noticed and was grateful for. I decided that weekend that I was going to put the property into a trust, not immediately, but within the next year or two. The trust would eventually benefit both my children equally, along with the grandchildren. It would be structured properly, with a lawyer and a financial advisor, accounting for the capital gains implications and the fair market value, and all the things that need to be accounted for when you do these things the right way. I told my daughter this. I told her not because I owed her an explanation, but because she is my daughter. And I wanted her to know that the future of the house was still something I was thinking carefully about. That I hadn't written her or her children out of anything. that what had happened hadn't ended the story. It had just forced it to be told honestly, which was overdue. She cried a little, on the phone. I let her. My son-in-law and I reached something workable eventually. Not warmth. I won't pretend we arrived at warmth. But a kind of functional respect, which at our stage of the situation was more useful anyway. He is not a bad man. He is an ambitious one who made a serious miscalculation about what was his to be ambitious about. I've known enough people in my life to understand that the line between confidence and entitlement is one that's easy to cross when circumstances keep letting you. He had been led across it, gradually, for 4 years, and nobody had drawn it back in until I sat down at the kitchen table and laid out 3 pieces of paper. That's partly on me. It's a thing I've sat with. What I know now that I wish I had known in 2019 is that kindness and clarity are not opposites. You can open your home to someone and still say, clearly, here is what this is and what it isn't. You can love someone and still have a piece of paper that says what belongs to whom. Letting things be vague because spelling them out feels uncomfortable or transactional. That is not generosity. It is just postponing a harder conversation for when everything is already more complicated. My wife would have known that. She was always the one who could say the necessary things without making them feel like weapons. I've spent a lot of time missing that particular quality of hers. I'm still in Collingwood. I like it here. I've gotten to know the town properly in a way I hadn't when it was just a property I drove past on weekends. There's a coffee shop on the main street where the owner knows my order, and a trail along the waterfront I walk most mornings, and a retired couple down the road who have me over for dinner about once a month. It's a quiet life, and I find I'm no longer apologizing to myself for wanting a quiet life. My grandchildren came to stay with me here last summer. A whole week, just the 3 of us. We rented kayaks and drove up to see the caves at the provincial park, and I let them stay up too late and eat too much junk food, because that is precisely what grandparents are for. At the end of the week, my older grandchild, she's 15 now, sharp as anything, said, "Grandpa, I'm glad you have a nice place to live." I didn't know whether she knew anything about what had happened, or whether it was just the innocent observation of a teenager. I decided it didn't matter. I just told her I was glad too. Because I am. I am genuinely glad. The house is still mine. The story is still mine to tell. And for the first time in a few years, I feel like I'm the one telling it.